I'm now very happy to introduce our next speaker, Rob Franciosi, who's a professor at Grand Valley State University, and he is sponsored by the Cucci Office for Local History at Grand Valley. Rob's work on the Holocaust includes the Elie Wiesel Conversations, the memoir Good Morning by Grand Rapids survivor Joseph Stevens, and articles on such writers as Anne Frank, Art Spiegelman, and William Styron. He's completing a book manuscript, Imagining the Ghetto, John Hershey's The Wall, and American Holocaust Memory, and also working on an edition of We Will Never Die, a 1943 pageant intended to raise American awareness regarding the fate of European Jews. Besides teaching courses on the Holocaust at Grand Valley, he has conducted workshops at the Holocaust Memorial Center in Farmington Hills, escorted student groups on study trips to Germany and Poland, and participated in Holocaust Education Foundation ventures in Eastern Europe and in Israel. Last summer, he was a fellow at the Holocaust Research Institute, Royal Holloway, University of London. I present you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Can everyone hear me? It's very odd. I've never used one of these things, so I hear myself behind myself, so I hope the guy behind me does a good job. Okay. A common myth regarding the Holocaust is that few Americans knew about the murder of Europe's Jews until liberation of the Nazi camps in the spring of 1945. Although most American soldiers were indeed unprepared for what they encountered at Dachau and Buchenwald, scholars have established that political leaders in the White House and in the State Department knew a great deal about the fate of millions under Nazi occupation. But did this information reach average Americans on the home front? Historian Deborah Lipstadt's 1986 book on the American press during the Holocaust proved that the Nazi war against the Jews had found its way into a wide array of American daily papers between 1935 and 1945. The information may not have been page one news, may in fact have been buried in the inner pages, but the stories did indeed enter American homes. Back issues of the fully digitized New York Times reveal how the paper of record covered the Holocaust, while the Washington Post from the same period contains what those in the corridors of power read over their morning coffee. You can do keyword searches, allowing you to uncover items outside the main news sections, from letters to the editor, public meeting announcements, paid ads, etc. But not all important news resources from the past have been digitized. Some never will be, especially daily newspapers from small to mid-sized cities across the United States. Cognizant of this digital divide, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has embarked upon a major crowdsourcing initiative. Called History Unfolded. By drawing on the efforts of citizens historians, the USHMM's project aims to chart, quote, what was possible for Americans to have known about the Holocaust as it was happening, and how Americans responded. Volunteers choose from 37 events between 1933 and 1945, search microfilms of their local newspapers, copy relevant articles as PDFs or JPEGs, and then upload them to a national database. As of December 1st, 2017, the digital clip file contained 10,137 entries, though only 226 from Michigan and just 12 from Grand Rapids. Last winter, students in my Holocaust seminar, America and the Holocaust, contributed to History Unfolded by researching Holocaust events between 1933 and 1945 as covered by the Grand Rapids Press and the Grand Rapids Herald. They used microfilms available in the local history collection at the library and began to upload their work to the USHMM database. I joined them in the task, and there are now 80 clips from Grand Rapids that have been added to the database, though we have at least that many more still to upload. And this term, my seminar students will be researching 16 more events, as well as working to add those from last year to the USSM site. So what did we find? To give you a sense of what we uncovered, I will trace today how 3 events during the Holocaust were covered by the Grand Rapids daily papers. First, the April 1933 Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. Next, the November 1938 pogrom, more commonly known as Kristallnacht. And finally, the April 1945 liberation of concentration camps by American troops. Most scholars consider April 1933 as the beginning of what would be called the Holocaust. During this month, a host of anti-Jewish laws were enacted, but for newspapers at the time, the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st was the most widely covered story. Indeed, even in Grand Rapids, as you'll see, it was front-page news. And just to briefly explain the mechanism of this boycott, you can see it from the photograph up there. Nazi political troops, the SA, the so-called brown shirts, would stand outside Jewish businesses, particularly in the major cities like Berlin and Munich, and warn people not to go in. And it was calculated to have the greatest effect because it happened on the Saturday before Easter Sunday, when a lot of people would have been out buying goods. Ironically, because the prices at some Jewish stores were much more competitive, a lot of Germans got around this by buying all of their Easter provisions on the Friday before. Because of I know some of these newspaper images can be hard to see. I tried to use some red boxes so that you'll at least be able to see the headlines. But as you can see, here we have the Grand Rapids Herald on April 1st. Hitler limits Jewish ban to 1 day. So it was front page news. Similarly, in the Grand Rapids Press, Nazi boycott of Jews in force. One of the interesting challenges of doing this project is getting students from 2018 and 19 to learn how to read a newspaper. I asked the other day, and there's not one in the class who reads a daily newspaper. And so they need to be schooled on, the importance of the front page, how the top headline is most significant, but also how the lead story tends to be on the right-hand side of the page. And as you can see here, some of the language that would become common in American newspapers referring to the brown shirts. Already by 1933, Americans who read the press and the Herald knew what that meant. And as you can see, even a few days later, this is April 2nd, the boycott was still on the front page. Though as a story gets older, it obviously moves either deeper into the paper or it simply disappears. And as a little aside, I tell my students it's very difficult when you're reading these newspapers to not get distracted. And I think this is a perfect example. The amount of murder and mayhem that I noticed on the front pages in Grand Rapids newspapers, everything from a principal who was obsessed with a woman and ended up murdering her. It was just every day it seemed there was another murder. And so the idea that, things were so much safer back in the 1930s is really exposed when you look at these daily papers. But as you can see, it was still on the top. Now, part of this project is also to force the students to get beyond the headlines and to look at the editorial page, where occasionally there would be commentary in the editorials, and very rarely, but not without precedent, letters to the editor. And the students I've found in going over some of their work are not the best at really scanning the editorial pages, so I fear some of that is going to have to be redone. But when you do find letters, they're really quite interesting. And I'll give you one example here. This is a letter to the editor, April 3rd, and the headline, "Jew-baiting Germans Hurt Own Country." And I'll just quote from it briefly. "The whole horrible drama is nauseating to the core. There can be but one explanation. Hitler is a madman." And then he concludes, "I'm proud to observe that these peace-loving United States are wasting no time in demonstrating their contempt for Hitler's crude, barbaric practices." This becomes a common motif in nearly all headlines and articles, where Hitler becomes the equivalent of whatever is happening in Nazi Germany. He's the stand-in, and you will see it in headlines, and you see it as early as 1933 in the letters to the editor. One distinction I've noticed between the two newspapers, and I'll skip through some of these, is that the Grand Rapids Press seemed to have more photographs than the Grand Rapids Herald. And particularly, they would have this full page of photographs with highlights from the week. And obviously, because the Nazis were very photo-worthy, you get some interesting images from the early years of the Holocaust. This first one, though, is actually a picture of young people in a New York City park protesting the Nazi boycott. But this is much more typical. Nazis marching in the streets of Berlin, and as was common in the 1930s, the captions were sometimes very witty and very ironic. And so the headline here says, "Nazis take time out in their boycott program against the Jews to march." The real explosion of violence against Jews in Nazi Germany, and what has really been marked as the end of their future as members of the society, was the so-called Kristallnacht pogrom of November 9th, 10th, 1938. And it got, probably in American newspapers, the most coverage of any event. Though curiously enough, it seemed to be somewhat underplayed in the Grand Rapids papers, and I'm not 100% sure why that was so. It was prompted by the shooting of a Paris embassy official, Ernst von Raum, by a young Jewish teenager, Herschel Greenspan. Greenspan's Polish-born parents had been deported from Germany a few weeks before and forced into a no-man's land between the two countries. He was so upset about this that he went to the embassy intending to kill the ambassador. Von Rath was a minor official, so he shot him instead. And 2 days later, Von Rath died. And as soon as he died, the Nazis agitated and used this as an excuse for a massive outbreak of violence. The records tell us that as many as 1,400 synagogues across Germany and Austria were set on fire. Dozens of Jews were killed, and some 30,000 men arrested and sent to concentration camps. Curiously enough, the day of the event, November 10th, the Grand Rapids Herald barely acknowledged it. It was in the center there, Berlin vents fury on Jews, but the main story was about the recent election. And at first I was speculating, thinking maybe this was a Republican paper, it was Arthur Vandenberg's former paper, but I think there was a more practical issue. The press and the Herald came out at different times. The Herald was the morning paper, the press was the evening paper. And as I learned the other night, the Herald, in essence, had to be put to bed by midnight each night. And because of the 6-hour time delay, they missed out on the big story that happened overnight in Germany. Even after and once they missed out to some degree, they allowed the press to do more of the coverage, I think. You could see here, even the next day, it was underplayed. Though they did offer an editorial very, very soon after. And this editorial, I think, was really quite a change. It says, Germany, which holds itself so highly cultured, so far ahead of the rest of the world in civilization, is now engaged in a persecution of the Jewish people in a manner that is truly barbaric. The entire world is shocked and nauseated at what has been going on. This is a very common motif in editorials and in comments, contrasting Germany as the most civilized, or one of the most civilized countries in the world, with the barbarism that they were committing. The press had much more extensive coverage, and I dropped one of the slides which showed the first night, which was even bigger. In fact, their coverage of the first night's events was more dramatic than the New York Times, which really played up this story. Interesting, especially interesting for my purposes, is that the press also highlighted the response of other religious leaders. And in this instance, Catholic prelates and others protested Jewish oppression. The reason I say this is interesting is because within 2 weeks of the Kristallnacht pogrom, the story in the Grand Rapids papers would turn toward a more local connection. And this local connection would get top-of-the-mast headlines. And it had to do with by now infamous radio priest, as he was called, who was out of Royal Oak, Michigan, Father Charles Coughlin. And I'll talk about him in a second here. Coughlin was from Canada originally, and he was at a parish in Royal Oak, Michigan, and at the peak of his influence, he received 80,000 letters a week. They had to create a new post office box just for him. The audience of his weekly radio broadcast was in the tens of millions, and his journal, Social Justice, eventually reached 1 million subscribers. Anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and isolationist. That's the best way to describe Coughlin. And in the days and weeks after Kristallnacht, he defended the state-sponsored violence of the Nazi regime, arguing that Kristallnacht was justified in retaliation for Jewish persecution of Christians. And you can see here, and the reason I have the two set up is, you can't quite read it, the top one says, priests ready to rap critics. And I set this up as a juxtaposition deliberately because below it is, Germany halts rioting against Jews. And so the irony of this guy defending his position with what was still going on was not lost on the newspaper people who decided to put these side by side. Radio priest defends talk. And then, as you can see, as the controversy grew, the prominence of his position as a spokesman for anti-Semitic attitudes started getting coverage on the front page. He gets a warning from the church. The press and the Herald both emphasized this story. Radio priest defends himself upon the air. It's one of the biggest headlines dealing with the Holocaust that the Herald ever printed. And I think it really would be interesting to have a student do a project exploring just how they treated Coughlin over the years in the newspaper. Even here, he's still front page news. This is several weeks after, and here he has misquoted Henry Ford. The Henry Ford, and we won't get into Henry Ford as an anti-Semite, but the idea that Coughlin was claiming that a rabbi had misquoted Henry Ford that's too much of a rabbit hole for me to go down. Jewish shops in hands of Aryans, yet again, the same story on the front page. And the reason I wanted to touch on this at the length I'm giving it, this is one of the few instances that I've seen in all the resources where someone from the Jewish community was actually featured in one of the Grand Rapids newspapers regarding what we would call today the Holocaust. You can see in this headline, Rabbi to voice plea to Pope. This was Rabbi Jerome Folkman of Temple Emmanuel. And this was a couple of days before he gave a sermon. And this sermon petitioned the Pope to condemn Father Coughlin. He questioned whether Father Coughlin's public utterances, quote, are consistent with the dictates of common decency, to say nothing of the dignity of the holy priesthood and the high and lofty traditions of the church. And what I find really compelling about his plea to the Pope is that he was speaking, from across an interfaith line that wasn't the most comfortable in the late 1930s. And if you read anything about the Pope, Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope throughout the Holocaust, he finally was not the most sympathetic listener towards such a plea. But it's a really unique moment in the material I've seen so far, in that it's the only instance in which someone from the press seemed to decide, we should talk to the Jewish community about what's happening to the Jews in Europe. This one was in, I believe it's the Grand Rapids. I can't see it on my screen. It was the press. Yeah, it's the Grand Rapids Press. Okay. I'll now turn in the last part here to the end of the war, when, with the liberation of the concentration camps, Americans discovered, quote unquote, what had been perpetrated in Europe during the years of Nazi occupation. On April 4th, 1945, at the top of the front page of the Grand Rapids Press, there was a photograph intended to shock its readers. Though unfortunately, the image was all too familiar, it would be all too familiar to us. The quality of the microfilm was so bad that I'm not sure you could have even made out what the image was, so I decided I would just have to resort to words instead of a bad scan. So I'll try and describe it for you. Two emaciated young men rest on simple bunks. They offer blank stares to the camera, with their stick-like legs dominating the photograph's center. It's the only image of camp survivors to appear in either paper during the April-May period of the war. And the headline that would get connected to it was that it shocked the entire civilized world. One of the ironies about this image is that it is not an image of concentration camp victims, but it was an image of American POWs. With the end of the war, the newspapers were just, when you read the papers from the 1930s, and you get a sense of a fairly normal state of affairs. But as the war ended, the headlines were just coming fast and furious. You had the Americans crossing into Germany. You had the discovery of the camps. It must have been a very exciting time to work for a newspaper. And nevertheless, the Holocaust became, again, front page news, despite everything from the death of Roosevelt to the end of the war to the new concern about engagements with the Russians. And so you see on the top here, 20,000 died in Madhouse Murder Factory. It says Nazis killed 5 million Jews. Nazi atrocities shock world. This is the article that, in fact, is about the treatment of POWs, not about the atrocities in the camps. And this is very common. Newspapers in another era kept the reporters in the background. They never used they never injected their personal opinions. They never went on to MSNBC or Fox News to give their views of what they thought might happen or what would happen or should happen. But if you read some of the accounts by the war correspondents who encountered the camps, Dachau and Buchenwald in particular, the editors seem to allow a breakdown of this so-called objective stance in Germany, in journalism. And so you get personal accounts by the reporters. And so in this particular piece, City of Living Lifeless Dead, which actually appeared in both papers, very rare for the same article to appear in both papers. They were competitors. They wanted to distinguish themselves from one another, but this piece apparently was viewed as so important that it appeared in both. And it was by William Fry, and it was about the Belsen, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which actually was liberated by the British. And I'll just read a little bit to give you a sense of the tone. I saw Belsen, its piles of lifeless dead and its aimless swarms of living dead. And then he repeats this intonation. I saw these dead. I saw the living beside these dead. I saw children walking about in this hell. Children, the first I saw, I'll never rub out of my mind. It's unprecedented in the journalism of the 1940s. And it's a really fascinating development that comes out of trying to respond to the Holocaust. As you can see, Belsen horror camp yields living dead, this image of the living dead. And then you also had other responses. This one by the famous cartoonist, those of us who remember the crazy machines that are associated with him. This was Rube Goldberg. But instead of the cartoons he would be known for, this is a pretty biting image. And it says, those are the German people, record of German brutality, and it's cut off at the top for whatever reason, but it says, with him forever. And in the distance, Germany is walking toward eternity, that they would be responsible for this forever. Another development at the end of the war was the idea that journalists and editors had been underplaying these events to some degree, And so they sent editors from some of the major newspapers, as well as members of Congress, to the camps to witness what was there. And newspapers all over the country then had these editorial statements saying, yes, we saw this, it was all true. It's a very interesting idea that a newspaper would not only do reporting, but feel that they needed to send their editors, because the editors had a kind of authority that perhaps the readers would have felt the individual reporters didn't quite possess. And then there are other kind of motifs in these articles, particularly what was inflicted on or wrought upon the Germans who lived around these camps. They were forced to look at the bodies, and in many cases they were forced to rebury the dead. And then you still get the kinds of personal accounts. This one is about Buchenwald, and it's from an editor, and I think this is important to hear. They say, Buchenwald prison should not be confused with prison camps where American soldiers were kept. This editor had been actually in a prison camp during the First World War, and he said, I doubted all of the stories I heard from Germany until I saw this. And he says then, this is something it will take the civilized world a long time to forget. And I will kind of skip through some of this to get to this letter, which I find really interesting. At the same time as the Holocaust was being discovered, the nascent UN was starting to meet in San Francisco. They were working out the details of what the UN might be. And this was a letter to the editor from a woman who didn't think much of the conversation at the UN. She says, a peace conference, why not then a retribution conference by those who were the unfortunate victims of German and Japanese atrocities? Who, if not these, are most entitled to say what shall be done with inhuman creatures, so-called war criminals? And so there was a kind of sense of, we need to take revenge. These people need to be punished for this. I'm going to skip through some of this and get to another picture by Rube Goldberg. And this one is really quite compelling because it lists the starvation of Allied prisoners, mass executions, enslavement of conquered peoples, but then gas chamber horrors. And it's an acknowledgement of what had been discovered, even though, in fact, there really were not the gas chamber killing installations in the Western camps that the Allies had liberated. Those were in places like Auschwitz and Treblinka and in Poland for the most part. Of course, pictures can tell a lot more than just words. And at the end of the war, there was an unprecedented release of imagery that never would have been shown to American audiences. And this was in the newsreel footage of the liberated camps. And this is a shot here of the Powers Theater, which during the 1940s apparently became a full-time newsreel venue. And this headline here is about the crowds lining up to view so-called Nazi horror films. For the first time in motion picture history, censorship has been dropped to permit the public to see concrete evidence which verifies beyond doubt stories issued by American press the past 4 years. And there were all sorts of warnings: do not bring children to this. Don't miss it, though. Really quite a powerful effect on people. There were long crowds going in to see these films. in the warning below, it says the atrocity pictures were passed by the censor because our government feels that now is the time to dispel the doubts regarding stories that have come out of Europe during the past 4 years. These pictures are terrible beyond description. We promise you, and this is, I think, really important, we promise you these films will renew your faith in the American press and crystallize your opinion as to what the peace should be for Nazi Germany. So the newsreel footage was used, one, to talk about what the consequences should be for Nazi Germany, but also to celebrate the role of American journalism in finally exposing what the Nazis had done. And it's a pretty heroic image. And if any of you have been to the Washington Holocaust Museum, you know when you go up through the elevator, the first thing you see is a photograph of Allies staring at the ruins of a concentration camp. And for most Americans, that idea of America discovering the Holocaust in April of 1945 is something that I think was partly reinforced by these newsreels and over time has come to dominate what people claim they knew and when they supposedly knew it. But one of the things that is interesting in going through these newspapers is that there was much more information, and in fact very accurate information that was available, but it just was not presented prominently. And so I want to end with that by showing you a few examples. This is from 1942, November of 1942. Grand Rapids Press, November 25th, in fact. And buried at the bottom of the front page, Hitler orders murder of all Jews in Nazi Europe. This was an official announcement by the U.S. State Department saying that 2 million Jews had already been murdered and that there were plans to kill 4 million more. This is in the Herald. The same story. Reports Hitler has ordered all Jews liquidated. And this is actually from 1944. 2 Jews had escaped from Auschwitz and gave a report of what they had experienced. It was not really given much prominence in the American newspapers. This is on, I think, page 3 or 2 of the Grand Rapids Press. And the War Refugee Board was the official board to rescue remnants of Jews, particularly Hungarian Jews, in 1944-45. And I just want to end by quoting from one short section to show how much Americans, in fact, could have known if they had really paid attention. Large family convoys arrived from various countries and were at once directed to the Birchwood. The special squad, Sonderkommando, employed for gassing and burning, worked in day and night shifts. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were gassed during this period. This is remarkably accurate. And not only accurate, but even using the language of the camp itself, the Sonderkommando. And as a kind of last word, I guess, on this topic, one of the things that has occurred to me in going through how Grand Rapids papers engaged the Holocaust is that there was an element not of denial, but of disbelief that permeated newspaper reporting in the 1940s. So much so that there was a really interesting book about how Protestant media covered the Holocaust. And the title of that book was So It Was True. And that idea that, in fact, it was true is something that it never quite penetrated during the 1940s. And this was not unique to the Grand Rapids Press. The same could be said of major newspapers like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. There's a lot of research to be done still on this newspaper, and this is just the kind of first pass that my students have made. And I hope some of it's of interest to you. And there are many local newspapers in Michigan still to be searched. If you have an interest in Muskegon or Mount Pleasant or Traverse City, I'd be happy to set you up and let you know what's involved in doing it. Thank you. I think I have time for a few questions.
Rob, who were the editors of the Herald and the Press at that time?
That's a good question. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a local Grand Rapidian, and I had to ask my friend Diana Barrett, when were I know one was the morning paper and one was the afternoon paper. When did they actually go to bed? I think this is really interesting. There's some real possibilities for research on just how Grand Rapids dealt with this, and who the editors were would make a big difference.
Any comments on the impact on students from this research?
It's been very interesting. The ones who have found a lot, I think, were really engaged by it, and were really surprised to see it receive such prominence. The ones who came up dry would never have survived if they had been, gold miners in California, and because not every pan had nuggets in there, and they just couldn't. Oh, I spent 5 hours, didn't find anything, and I said, well, that's important. They couldn't see the importance of that.
I would like to get to the premise of your speech about Grand Rapidians and what did they know of the Holocaust. I'd like to point out that in Grand Rapids, over the years, Jews weren't allowed to join clubs, business clubs, or golf courses. Into the 60s.
Huh.
So it should give you a little insight about what type of sympathy might have been.
Yeah. I think that's a.
That's a much more important point than what was given out in the newspaper.
She needs a. Would you use the mic? Okay. It wasn't a question. It was, I think, an astute comment.
It's a point. It's a question to you, really. Oh. That getting to your point of what did Grand Rapidians know of the Holocaust during the time by the information that they got from the newspapers? Mm-hmm. Well, the newspapers give out information, mm-hmm. but how it's interpreted is a different thing. And my point was, or it's not a point, it's a fact, that Jews weren't allowed to join business clubs mm-hmm. in Grand Rapids, nor were they allowed to join golf courses until the 60s. And I think that says something.
Sure.
And my question is, what do you think? You can give information, but if there's this type of information, you can wonder how much sympathy was there.
Well, I think that's a really legitimate point. There clearly was anti-Semitism in Grand Rapids, as there was throughout the United States. But I would say that at least the Father Coughlin episode shows that there were sort of limits to how much people would accept. For whatever reason, the newspaper at least felt this was important to put in on the front pages. Now, they clearly were not aiming it at their Jewish readers in Grand Rapids, and most of the headlines and most of the stories are fairly sympathetic to the plight of the Jews, as were the editorials. Now, that may be more of the public persona as opposed to private acceptance, and I think that is at the heart of what you're saying.
But those articles were written by the AP; they weren't written locally.
That's right. He said that they were written by the AP, not locally, and that's true. But they chose what to include when they made up the newspaper. I think it's investigating how the Jewish community interacted or didn't interact with the press on this is something I'm especially interested in pursuing.
Something you might be interested in the amount of information that came out of our government. 442nd was an infantry battalion made up of Japanese Americans, and they liberated Dachau first. Patton took the credit for it. And we have a recipient of the Dachau that still lives in West Michigan, northeast Grand Rapids. And I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of years ago, and he became a dentist. And I think he's in his late 90s right now.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because one of the surprising elements for me is the lack of newspapers contacting soldiers who actually had witnessed this. They've been recorded now for video, and there were a lot from West Michigan. There are people from Muskegon, people from Grand Rapids, and yet the newspaper did not look for that local angle, and that was a loss, I think.
No more time.
I'd be happy to talk to anyone out at lunch.